This is the IBJ Podcast for the week of Tuesday, May 28th, 2024, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. 3 weeks ago, we released an episode of the IBJ Podcast explaining the sudden, multifaceted, and high-pitched battle over building a soccer stadium in downtown Indianapolis. Since then, the drama has taken several turns, with fresh revelations about what's underneath the ground set aside for the stadium complex that developer Keystone Group wants to build, and who owns the land the city has identified for another site that Mayor Joe Hogsett's administration has championed. Meanwhile, a proposal for a taxing district that would cover most of the cost for the latter stadium is wending its way to the City-County Council, with a key committee vote coming this evening. So, we thought this would be a great opportunity to bring you up to date. IBJ's Shuey has been on top of the story from the beginning and has a piece in the latest issue of IBJ about what a stadium for Major League Soccer, America's highest professional league, would look like. But first, let me set the stage for folks who are new to this issue. In late April, everything that we had assumed about the future of pro soccer in Indianapolis and the creation of a publicly owned downtown stadium for the Indy 11 soccer team received a swift kick between the stitches. The owner of the Indy 11, who also owns the development firm Keystone Group, accused the city of backing out of negotiations to finalize the stadium deal. Then, Mayor Joe Hogsett announced that the city indeed had stopped stadium negotiations, believing the numbers didn't add up. Indy 11 and Keystone representatives disagreed. Hogsett also said the city had been working with an undisclosed group of investors who believed they could bring a Major League Soccer franchise to the city. In fact, Hogsett disclosed that he had just met face-to-face with MLS officials in New York and believed the time was right for Indianapolis to take its shot at the top rung of American pro soccer. Since our last podcast, IBJ broke the story that the Simon family, which owns Indiana Pacers and Indiana Fever, has purchased a large swath of land where the investor group's stadium would be located. City-County Council President Bob Ossoly volunteered to sponsor the proposal for financing the stadium after the councilor for that district refused to do so. On May 28th, the same day this podcast debuts, the proposal will be considered by the council's Rules and Public Policy Committee, which Ossoly chairs. Although a vote to deny the proposal won't stop it from reaching the City-County Council. And it may be the biggest revelations yet. Both the Hogsett administration and Keystone revealed what they know or have projected about the human remains and grave sites that are buried on the 20-acre site Keystone has been trying to develop. The study and reinterment of those excavated remains have become a major issue in this increasingly complex battle over who gets to build and occupy a downtown soccer stadium. So, here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Shuey. Mickey, I know you're busy covering the Indiana Global Economic Summit today, but I really appreciate you taking time.
Thanks for having me. It's I would say it's been a while, but as we'll discuss, it really hasn't.
It has not been a while. This is a great indication of how fast this story is evolving. So I approached you yesterday afternoon, which was the Wednesday before this podcast will air. If you could record a podcast today, meaning Thursday, about your story in this week's print edition, that story is about what a new soccer stadium in Indianapolis would look like, and how it would compare to soccer-first stadiums recently constructed in Cincinnati and St. Louis. About an hour after that conversation, a whole new chapter in the saga started to unfold. Mayor Joe Hogsett's administration said it was offering to buy the Indy 11 site from Keystone Group, while heavily insinuating that it needed to be involved in determining how to properly study and relocate buried remains on the site from its use last century as a cemetery or cemeteries.
I think it's been multiple cemeteries.
Multiple cemeteries, yeah, at different times and different places in that area. Just hours later, Keystone fires back that it already was deep into such a process, having discovered 87 burials on a 6-acre portion of the property, which is about 20 acres. Keystone also said it has been following a rigorous process of studying and excavating the remains, including procedures approved by the Indiana Department of Natural Resources and Department of Historic Preservation and Archaeology. So I think you noted this in your story. One of the things that was interesting about this was that in this exchange between the two parties, we got really the most information that we've seen so far.
It certainly was a revealing exchange in terms of discussion about the discoveries on these sites. And certainly we can't promise that as we have this conversation, more is not going to come out. But we know what we know right now, and that is that the city thinks that it has about 650 remains on its 1 acre parcel. And I'm sure we'll get into this here in a bit. But then you've got Keystone, which said that on a 6 acre portion of its site, which is largely the area that was previously the diamond chain manufacturing buildings.
Yeah, the plant itself.
Yeah, kind of the northern portion of that site, not the western portion where the stadium would be, but the northern portion of the site. They have 87 burials. So we've kind of got almost an apples and oranges comparison going on because we don't know the true definitions of what each side is saying. We're still trying to figure all that out, but there's a lot of moving pieces here.
Yeah, just the semantics of it. I mean, it's as clear as mud. I mean, one side is talking about burials, the other side is talking about remains. But you did make a key distinction, is that is it clear that the 6 acre site that Keystone is talking about is fairly far away from the site that the city is talking about, the 1 acre that the city has acquired recently?
That's what I've gathered from my reporting yesterday and today, that this portion of the site is in fact not where the stadium would be located, which would be along the White River on the eastern bank of the White River.
So Keystone says it already has discovered 87 burials on the 6 acre portion of the property. They said had been successfully excavated, put that in quotes. So when Keystone is talking about excavation, what does a successful excavation mean?
Keystone says that the process involved archaeologists on site to identify possible signs of a grave. When that happened and when signs of remains were identified, mechanical excavation within a 100-foot radius of that discovery would pause, and archaeologists performed controlled excavations, essentially using hand tools and shovels, things like that. Now, the developer says that these excavation procedures were approved by the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, specifically its Department of Historic Preservation and Archaeology. And those remains that have been found are being analyzed and cataloged now by IUPUI Professor of Anthropology Jeremy Wilson. But Keystone is also contracted with Noblesville-based firm Weintraut & Associates for those excavation efforts.
What does Keystone say will happen to the remains that it finds?
So the company said yesterday that it planned to use the historic Mount Jackson Cemetery in Wayne Township, about 3 miles west of the property, for, quote, reinterment and memorialization, end quote, of the remains of the early Indianapolis settlers that are found on the site. To read at length here, after careful consideration and conversations with community leaders, Keystone Group has selected Mount Jackson Cemetery as a location for reinterment and memorialization, ensuring utmost respect and dignity for the findings, the company said. Now, Keystone said it plans to create memorials at the development site as well as the cemetery, the Mount Jackson Cemetery. It's also going to launch a website in the coming days to detail the history of the former burial grounds at the site. And from what I've gathered, they had been planning on doing that website probably sometime next week or the week after, but the city's letter essentially prompted them to move a bit more quickly on this than they had anticipated. So it seems like they were kind of caught off guard by the city's overture to purchase the land, which we'll get into, which led them to go ahead and release the figures that they have and has led us to dig for more information.
So when the city says that it's offering to buy the site from Keystone, I mean, we know since we cover real estate, that can mean a lot of things. What does the city say that means? Is it offering a particular price?
This letter that we're talking about is a correspondence that was sent by Deputy Chief Mayor Dan Parker to Keystone Group on Wednesday afternoon. And he basically said that the city is interested in putting forth, quote, an offer that we hope can fairly compensate Keystone for its efforts on the property. Now, the letter didn't include a specific price for this nearly 20-acre site, but we do know that the city by law can only pay the average of two independent appraisals for this site.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah.
So Keystone has told IBJ that it has invested more than $26 million over the past 2 years. And what I gather is just preparing the site. I mean, I guess there was demolition of the Diamond Chain site. They paid for that, I assume.
Those include both hard and soft costs. So the hard costs of demolition and site work, but also things like designing and engineering and back of house type stuff that you don't necessarily see happen on the site, but is integral to the demolition and development process. All in, that's about $26 million. And it kind of remains to be seen whether an appraisal would take that into account. I would expect that some of that investment would be incorporated into it. Certainly the amount that Keystone paid for the site back in 2022 would be taken into account, but every appraisal is a little bit different. So, which is why the city has to have two done to make sure that they're not just kind of getting a favorable one. And it also benefits the city as well in case it's appraised higher than they expect. So it's kind of just averaging it out kind of makes things a little bit more fair.
So in any event, what was Keystone's response to the overture from the city?
Well, to put it mildly, I'll just read what Jen Pavlik, the Keystone Group Senior Vice President, had to say. And in that she called it, quote, a last-ditch effort to salvage the bungled rollout of a half-baked idea. And that it is our hope Mayor Hogsett will once again retake the reins of his own administration and join us in a thoughtful adult discussion on the future of soccer and downtown development in our state's capital city. So make of that what you will, Mason.
It is a definitive response without actually saying no. It is interesting. I think there's kind of an ethos in Indianapolis government and Indianapolis development community that even when you disagree, you play nice. This kind of verbiage doesn't follow that path.
It doesn't, but it also, in some ways, reflects what we've seen happen elsewhere in recent years. I mean, back in 2019, when the Waterside deal fell apart on the former GM stamping plant site, we saw some pretty strong language from Ambrose Property Group at that time, the then owner of the site, after they essentially failed to secure additional incentives for that project and it fell apart. Then the city basically said, hey, we want to buy this or use eminent domain to get it back. And you heard some very decisive language from Ambrose on that. So I think it's not normal, it's also not unprecedented that a company would push back like this.
Okay, let's take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm, with more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with the latest edition of the IBJ Podcast and my interview with IBJ's Mickey Shuey about the latest developments in the battle over building a soccer stadium in downtown Indianapolis. Back to soccer. What is the next thing that is supposed to happen, official milestone in this story? I mean, something of import that will happen.
Well, Mason, it's interesting you ask that because the next milestone is actually, for some of our listeners who are listening the day of release, today, Tuesday, May the 28th, the Rules and Public Policy Committee will consider the professional sports development area designation that the Hogsett administration has put forth for the alternative site, they're calling it, but we know it's their preferred site, which is 355 East Pearl Street, which encompasses about 15 and a half acres over by the downtown Indianapolis heliport.
So the Rules and Public Policy Committee is supposed to consider this proposal to create what is essentially a taxing district.
Correct.
And the district the taxes collected from the district, which is, from my understanding, is a mess of sort of distinct and sometimes not at all related properties. The taxing funds from those properties would be collected to help finance the stadium.
That is correct.
What happens if the Rules and Public Policy Committee rejects the proposal on what is today, Tuesday, May 28th?
Well, as it happens, it's not going to necessarily mean anything other than a symbolic vote, because the measure will still receive a vote from the full council during its next meeting on June 3rd. Now, typically, if something is voted down in committee, it's very, very unlikely that it's going to be approved by full council. I don't know of a case where it's happened, but it may have before. But that vote will come with it having a caveat of being recommended for denial rather than recommended for approval. So the committee is essentially a recommendation body.
Okay. So this 11-member committee could vote to deny the proposal, but it still goes to the City County Council for their consideration, just with an asterisk that says, okay, this committee denied it for approval.
That is correct.
So in the end, it is still up to the 25-member City County Council to decide whether or not to approve the district.
That is correct. So with that, the city will need to get 13 votes in order for this to pass.
Now, when we last spoke, we didn't have any indication that anyone on the City County Council wanted to support the PSDA proposal, the district proposal, at least to the extent that they would offer to sponsor it. But what has happened since then?
Well, since then, we've heard from Council President Bob Osley, who chairs the Rules and Public Policy Committee and sponsored the mayor's proposal. He said in recent weeks that he made a last-minute decision to sponsor the measure in order for it to be introduced, because without a sponsor for such a proposal cannot be introduced before council. It has to have somebody backing it.
Simply to put it in play.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Now, Council Vice President Allie Brown and Councilor Ron Gibson have also attached their name to the proposal. Brown is also a member of the 11-member Rules and Public Policy Committee, so there's at least, I guess, 2 votes there in the committee.
But they haven't indicated that they're for it necessarily. It's just 2 people that said we're going to sponsor it.
Right. That's fair. Now, Councilor Kristen Jones, a Democrat representing that area, as well as the area, we should note, where the 11 Park PSDA has already been approved. She represents that entire district. So she would typically be the one called upon to sponsor this measure. But she said earlier this month that she wouldn't sponsor the proposal and was not aware at that time of a counselor who would.
Right. And then these other 2 counselors stepped in. At least they say just to let's get this in play and make a decision on it. And for people whose heads are spinning right now, because that can happen with the story, there was a separate PSDA approved already by the City County Council for the Keystone Group site. And that was already set, ready to go, but then that deal fell apart.
Right.
Not the deal for the PSDA, but the deal between the city and Keystone being able to come up with an agreement to participate together on the site and the project.
Right. And that PSDA was approved back in December. And just to kind of have a bit of an abbreviated timeline here, that was approved back in December. And then the city was first approached by Tom Glick in January, we've learned, the guy who was trying to put together this MLS bid for the city, this ownership group. But then the city, separate from that, suspended its negotiations with Keystone in March of this year. March 22nd was the last communication from the city to Keystone.
And Tom Glick represents this mysterious group of investors.
Yes.
Whose identities have not been revealed. That would try to get an MLS team for Indianapolis. And we know that these folks are probably extremely wealthy because the going rate for simply getting a franchise, an MLS franchise, is $500 million.
Right. That's how much San Diego paid for its franchise, which will join the MLS in 2025. So we're expecting that it'll be at least that much, if not more.
I think sometimes people get a little bit confused because, again, it's easy to get confused here and say that the city is trying to get an MLS team. Actually, what is happening is that this investor group is trying to attract the MLS team, and the city is doing whatever it can to make that happen.
That is correct.
Including creating this taxing district that would support the creation of the stadium, the development of the stadium.
Right. And honestly, I mean, sometimes it's challenging just for for me and my colleagues to kind of keep that straight. Not that we don't know it, but just using city as shorthand for this ownership group, because we think about it so much. I mean, I can honestly say I eat, breathe, sleep, and dream all this right now. So it's impacting everything right now, and it's a very unique situation, I think we could say.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with our editor, Leslie Weinbender, this morning, just about how hard it is to be a reputable news organization and to make sure everything is accurate. And when you're dealing with stories within a story about groups working within a group and within a group, it is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, because I mean, on its face, the goal is just tell the truth, but understanding what that truth is and how you explain that to readers can be a very complicated process.
And again, just to give people a window into, kind of how we think about this stuff. Another thing that we've discussed is making sure that when we talk about the city in this context, what we really are talking about is the Hogsett administration.
Correct.
Because obviously the City County Council, which represents a great part of the city, is the legislative body for the city, is obviously not all in favor of this and really hasn't even weighed in on it yet to speak of. This is really being driven by the Hogsett administration. Correct.
And in fact, Taylor Wooten and I have tried multiple times to get in touch with numerous members of council to understand their position on this. And right now, there seems to be kind of a code of silence happening among council members to just not talk about it outside of their standard caucus meetings where they discuss this sort of business.
And, that could be an entirely different podcast,
right?
That we look forward to someday, about just simply a reporter's ability to speak directly with a legislator or with a counselor. Because, often we are confronted with layers of, I don't know what you would call necessarily, I wouldn't call them barriers, but they're gatekeepers. And, sometimes it is very difficult to speak with the person who's really making a decision. And I know that we are doing what we can to clarify and to get closer to the decision makers so we can let folks know out there, what's really happening, not what somebody wants us to think is happening.
Right.
So, moving on. In the meantime, Keystone is staging a public relations campaign for its stadium plan to put pressure on city officials. One assumes so the city will end up dropping its support for this MLS site, at least necessarily for the MLS stadium site that the city apparently prefers, which we will call the heliport site, and we'll explain more about that in a second. Can you tell me anything about this public relations campaign?
Well, Keystone's actually being pretty quiet on it, and what we know right now is that they're putting ads out on digital platforms like YouTube. They're doing a print campaign. Full disclosure, they did take an ad out in IBJ. I believe it was for last week's issue. I don't know if they have an ad in this week's issue, but that's entirely separate from us in the newsroom. But they're kind of trying to fight this on all fronts. They're doing internet. They had an ad on some platforms such as Hulu TV and YouTube TV for the NBA Eastern Conference Finals game between the Pacers and the Boston Celtics earlier this week. So they seem to really be trying to wage essentially an all-out public relations war on the city to try and win over support. I mean, during each of the past few Indy 11 games, the players have worn warm-up shirts to say Build 11 Park. And then we've seen the Brickyard Battalion kind of embrace that message too, because they care about the 11. They don't care about as much MLS or ownership groups or anything like that. They care about the tradition that they built with the Indy 11 over the past 10, 11 years. So that's kind of their focus as the team's big supporter group.
Yeah, from what I've seen of the ads, and this is not a complete survey, it is mostly extolling the benefits of the stadium as proposed by Indy 11.
Right. Nothing involving the other site. It's more just a singularly focused effort to build 11 Park, as they would put it. And that has also extended to text messages. There's people in the IBJ media offices who have received text messages from an unsolicited number basically saying, hey, sign our petition, send a letter to Mayor Hogsett and the administration saying that you'd prefer to see 11 Park get built to its fruition.
Now let's get to what previously was the juiciest bit of new information about the city's hopes to build a stadium on the heliport site. And when we say heliport site, that is shorthand for a series of parcels, including the Indianapolis downtown heliport, which all are basically a T-shot east of Gainbridge Fieldhouse and its big parking garage on Delaware Street. Now, as we said, nobody has officially revealed the identities of the investors who are behind this bid for an MLS team that would play in the stadium proposed for the heliport site. But we at IBJ reported a couple weeks ago that a big chunk of the earmarked site had just been purchased by a company affiliated with the Simon family, owners of Pacers Sports and Entertainment.
That's right. We found real estate records showing that on April 29th, this affiliate of the Simons spent $10.5 million to buy the 5.2-acre surface lot at 101 South Alabama Street. So think of the Virginia Avenue parking garage. Immediately east of that is the surface lot that is operated or has been operated by Dennison Parking. Now that would be a key site to control for whoever is trying to build this stadium.
Doesn't this essentially blow the cover on the Simons as investors in the bid for the MLS team in Indianapolis?
That's a complicated question, Mason.
Is it?
Now, I'll say that a consultant for the Pacers told IBJ that the Simon family's interest in the lot, quote unquote, predated soccer, and that the acquisition is entirely separate from the city's plans. Now, Pacers Sports Entertainment, which, as we've kind of alluded to, which is a parent company of Pacers and the Indiana Fever. In recent years, it's seen a lot of increased use of this lot for Gainbridge Fieldhouse-related activities, including parking for staff, television broadcast vehicles, and so on. And that's what the consultant said this lot is going to be used for as long as the Simons own the property, essentially. That's going to continue to be used for Gainbridge Fieldhouse operational purposes. And then they also mentioned potential future development. Now, I should note that in speaking with sources this week, it sounds like we're not the only ones asking this question about whether the Simons are involved. And they've been privately telling legislators and others that they don't have a hand in this pie right now. So whether there's truth there, whether they're just playing coy, certainly it remains to be seen.
Okay, back it up just for a second. So your sources are telling you the Simons are talking to legislators saying that they are not involved.
When they're approached by legislators, they are telling them that, hey, we're not involved in this. We like the idea, but we're not involved in this in any meaningful way at this point.
But in the meantime, they have purchased for $10 million a piece of property that would be key to building the stadium.
That is correct.
Let's turn our thoughts to what that stadium might look like. So you did a bunch of legwork in the last week or two to get a sense of what a modern MLS stadium would look like. Tell me about what you did.
So I had an opportunity to take trips to both St. Louis and Cincinnati to check out their MLS facilities. In St. Louis, I spent a blistering 24 hours in the city learning about what they call City Park. That's their 22,500 seat venue, about a mile and a half west of the Gateway Arch, right downtown. And then in Cincinnati, they've got TQL Stadium, which is about a 26,000 person venue, about 2.5, 3 miles west of downtown. So I was able to spend time at each of those facilities. I was there for games for each to see what the environment's like. Both very impressive facilities, and certainly learned a lot about what goes into making an MLS venue an MLS venue.
Okay, that's a good place to start. What are the things that MLS really requires of a stadium?
The standards for an MLS stadium, fairly minimal. First and foremost, the stadium always needs to be oriented north-south, at least with new stadiums, because they want to avoid direct sunlight in goalkeepers' eyes. So that's the bare minimum. You had to have a north-south stadium.
Oh, that's fascinating, because where the Indy 11 currently play, the Michael Carroll Stadium on IUPUI campus, that is an east-west stadium.
Correct. Now, a soccer stadium that would be built here in Indianapolis also needs to have ostensibly features that would make it eligible to host international soccer matches that are basically overseen by FIFA, the same group that runs the World Cup, for those who don't follow soccer on a regular basis. And basically that requires generally that there's a roof over the stands or some sort of extended awning over the stands that leaves the field open to the elements, so that way it gets fresh air, rain, all that, to make sure that the grass grows properly.
Oh, that was a question that I had. So I think, for example, the Michael Carroll Stadium, that is some kind of turf. That's an artificial turf. But MLS would require there to be real grass, real ground, real grass.
Yep. So essentially the field itself is a grass, whether that's Kentucky bluegrass, Bermuda, what have you. You have your kind of assortment of grasses that you can pick from, but then there's essentially a tarp around the perimeter of the field play itself that is typically made of a turf, where players warm up, where seating is, where photographers are shooting from, that basically acts as kind of a perimeter for the field itself.
How many seats, again, are they talking about for this?
So for the MLS stadium that the city has put forth, they really haven't said how many seats they want to have. But the Indy 11 stadium, the one at 11 Park that they've been trying to build, would consist of at least 20,000, but with expandability of up to 25,000.
And the stadiums in Cincinnati and St. Louis, how many seats?
St. Louis, 22,500, and then Cincinnati, 26,000.
Oh, 26, wow.
Yep. It's one of the larger soccer-specific stadiums, second only to Nashville, which has 30,000.
I know one of the questions that we've had in the newsroom is whether or not that heliport site would be big enough to contain an MLS stadium. What can you say about that?
So a typical MLS stadium takes anywhere from 9 to 14 acres just for the footprint of the building alone. Now, some are as small as 7.5 acres. I believe the one in Minnesota is about that size. Others are as big as 16 acres. The heliport site, as we're calling it, that is about 15.6 acres.
If they
amalgamated all the land and consolidated all the land and had control over the site that's basically bounded by Alabama to the west, Washington Street to the north, so it would cut off part of the Maryland Street hitch there, East Street to the east, and the CSX railroad tracks to the south.
This has been fascinating. Tell me if I get this right. The land that essentially has been identified as where the stadium would be, that isn't all land that is controlled by the city.
Correct. In fact, really none of it is. There's a parcel that's controlled by the Indianapolis Airport Authority. That is the heliport itself. And the city has a memorandum of understanding for the heliport with the IAA that basically would give the city an opportunity to purchase the site at market rate. So essentially using that same true appraisals strategy that they'd be taking with the 11 Park site, with the Diamond Chain site, where they could purchase that site and basically do what they want with it. Now, the heliport would need to be decommissioned and all that before any of that could happen, which is an extended process.
So the PSDA, I keep making sure I'm saying this right, is the PSDA.
Yes, PSDA.
If that is approved, that doesn't wrap everything up in a bow. The city would still need to get control of some of this land. And there are some landowners there who don't want to give up their land.
Correct.
Or there would be problematic in some way or the other. And apparently the Simons, who don't have a dog in this fight, they say, or so we hear they say.
Honestly, just for anyone to say that the PSDA puts this in a neat little bow is disingenuous, because that is the first step of what's going to be a very long process. Whether or not the PSDA gets approved will dictate whether the rest of all this happens, but this is going to be at least a 3-year process from the time the PSDAs would be approved to the time a stadium opens, but it's likely going to be a 4 years or longer process.
A couple more things just about the design of the stadium. I've noticed that from the outside, a lot of these new stadiums look sort of similar. Am I interpreting that correctly?
So the funny thing is that there's really two prevailing design theories, if you will, for MLS stadiums. One is more of an awning style roof that doesn't wrap all the way around. The other one is that 360-degree canopy. Interestingly, St. Louis, where I went first, has the kind of more open air design where its roof is made up of 2 or 3 different structures over the seats. The corners are open, so there's not really a lot of seating over there. It's more like plaza space, and you can see downtown, all that. Cincinnati is more of kind of this spaceship design, if you will, that has essentially an enclosed bowl. Now, there are other approaches. I mean, the Indy 11 have kind of touted their idea because it's kind of a mix of both. Like, it's got the 360-degree canopy, but the corners are left open. So you've got that going on. I'll say that as somebody who follows stadiums quite closely, we're not seeing the same kind of uniformity that perhaps we're seeing in the NFL right now, where a lot of the stadiums that have been put out there, whether it's Jacksonville or Tennessee or what have you, are very similar in their interior design, especially, but also exterior at times, to what we've seen with SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles and Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas.
In terms of cost, what can we say about the Cincinnati and the St. Louis Stadium?
The Cincinnati Stadium was about $250 million, and that was paid for by the ownership group with about, let's call it $60 million of public funding for infrastructure and a parking garage. In St. Louis, that was $461 million, although that also included an expansive training facility on the site too. So I don't know the specific cost of the stadium alone, but that was also paid for by the ownership group.
Okay, so that's a pretty big range.
Yep.
Remind me, so the state legislation that gave the city the ability to create the PSDA, does that require, I mean, no matter who is developing or who is authorizing it, does that require the group that would occupy the stadium to pay, is it 20% of the cost of developing the stadium?
Yes. Any group that was involved in the development of a stadium using that law would have to pay 20% of the costs. Now, it's a little fuzzy on whether that has to be hard construction costs or if it could include soft costs like design and engineering, all that sort of stuff.
So it would be funded largely through the proceeds from this tax district, but the team ownership, if that's a fair way to say it, would have to kick in 20%.
Essentially, yes.
Okay. All right. That's good to clarify. Okay, here's my dumb question. Every sports stadium built in Indianapolis in the last 30 years has been made of brick. How are they going to figure out how to get brick into this one?
I don't know, but I was actually wondering the same thing as I was looking at the designs for this, because I've not been told this, but my hunch is that they're probably going to somehow incorporate brick into this design.
Yeah, maybe just the entrance.
But I mean, designers they're good at what they do, especially these firms the ones that are familiar with building these facilities. Oftentimes they'll bring on local partners. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened here. And I think those firms will be able to really inject some local flavor into this stadium design if it were to move forward.
Yeah, to be clear, when you're designing something really at this scale, you do need to have a design company with national reach. I mean, they're the ones who have typically been designing things like this.
Right. They have the relationships with MLS to know exactly what needs to be done, how that needs to be done. They know the clearances for like trucks. They know what kind of concrete and cement to use. Like, they know all that good stuff. And that's no shade on our local design firms, because there's some excellent firms here locally who have contributed to these projects. But when it comes to a sports stadium that's being used by like a top tier league, you really need to have that national firm and have them bring on the local flavor.
Got it. I cannot predict exactly when we're going to revisit this. I assume it's going to be sooner rather than later.
I would expect so as well.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for making time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
My thanks again to Mickey Shuey. You can find his story on the potential design of a Major League Soccer stadium in Indianapolis on the front page of the latest print edition of IBJ. And there are a few other stories in this week's IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, the Health and Hospital Corporation of Marion County will break ground this summer on a multi-year $170 million facilities improvement plan. Taylor Wooten reports that work includes investment in multiple healthcare providers in a campus along 38th Street on the city's east side. Also in this week's issue, Sam Stahl explains how a company with franchises in Indiana and Ohio is helping vendors at major Indy sports facilities recycle cooking oil. And Dave Lindquist explores the popularity of music group tribute acts for bands such as ABBA and Queen and the Beatles, which are popping up with greater frequency on calendars for some local venues. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at IBJ.com. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ Podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.